Okay, we're glad to have everybody here with us tonight. Appreciate your being here, and hope everything will continue to go well with us and that get through these studies, and I hope it'll be a benefit to all of us. A lot of the things we're talking about are things that we know already, but there are some things that people have raised questions about. I said tonight we'll be talking about the idea of thou shalt not kill. I think we all understand that, but the question was raised by one person that says, you know, the fact that God has commanded thou shalt not kill, and then at other times God has commanded that His people needed to kill. And so is that not a contradiction then in what's being said there? Well, it may sound like it or seem like it initially. There are times in the Bible that you're going to find contradictions. You remember what God told Adam and Eve, if they ate of that forbidden fruit, on the day thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. But Satan contradicted that. He said, thou shalt not surely die. Now that's a contradiction. But you're not going to find a time when God contradicts Himself. And when God said, thou shalt not kill, is not a contradiction to when He commanded His people to kill. And so we want to try to look at some of those things tonight as we talk about it, but that's the main deal. You shall not kill, God said. That's found for us here in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 13, the King James Version. And I don't know about you, but I pretty much grew up on the King James. I now use the New King James. I use the New American Standard. I use the Revised Standard. I try to look at several different ones to get a better idea of exactly what's being taught and said. But I grew up with a King James. When I started off to college, that's what I had was a King James Version. And consequently, you know, that's what I quote most often. But you look at the King James and it says, thou shalt not kill. That's in chapter 20 and verse 13. But you go just one chapter later, Exodus 21 and verse 12, and God says, he that smiteth a man so that he dies shall be surely put to death. So here's God commanding, if there's somebody in your group, someone that kills somebody, hits them and causes them to die, then that person, He said, you shall surely put to death. Yes, sir. Well, yeah, I understand that. I thought this class looked too good for... All right. Any of y'all that want to be in that class, you're fine to leave. That's not going to hurt me. All right, but anyhow, so here's the time. One time God is saying, thou shalt not kill. Then He's telling His people, anybody that strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. That person needs to be put to death. So what's the solution to this? Well, the main problem, I think, is understanding what God said there and giving of the Ten Commandments. Literally, if you look at that, what He's talking about is, you shall not murder. That's the New King James Version. Several other newer translations gives it that way. And I know, like in the New Testament, I was surprised to learn there are 7 different words in the Greek language in the New Testament that can be and are at times translated kill. But there's one Greek word that, though it is translated sometimes as kill, it is also sometimes translated as murder. And it's interesting to me to notice the times when that is the case. The word is the word for nuo, and it's 2 different times in the New Testament where it's translated as murder. And the thing that's intriguing to me about that is the quotations in those passages. The first of these is found in the book of Matthew, chapter 19 and verse 18. And this is Jesus talking. This is the occasion where, you know, the rich young rulers asked Jesus, what must I do to be saved? You know, and Jesus said, keep the commandments. And He said, which ones? And Jesus begins reciting there the 10 commandments. And there it is. He said to him, which ones? Jesus said, you shall not murder. Now He's quoting there from the 10 commandments as given in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 13. But instead of saying you shall not kill, it's translated with that word for nuo, you shall not murder. So that lets us know that's what God was talking about when He gave that command long ago. He's not saying you shall not kill, because there are times it's going to be necessary that God's people will have to kill. But He's saying you shall not murder. Well, what's the difference? What is murder? You say murder is killing somebody. Well, then what's the difference between murder and killing? Or the intent in it. And that's one of the things we're going to notice here in a few minutes as we look. Surprisingly enough, too, to me, I didn't realize it, but there are 16 things that a person could do under the old law whereby he could kill someone and it would be accepted as being right. But it's in putting to death those people who have violated God's law in some way. And there are 16 things that a person could do that in God's law demanded death penalty for that person. And we'll look at those. But this is one of the times where Jesus is quoting from the Ten Commandments, and He quotes it not as you shall not kill, but you shall not murder. The other time that it's used is in Romans 13:9. This is the Apostle Paul speaking here. And Paul says, for the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So Paul begins here, he's quoting from the Ten Commandments. But notice there, he didn't say there and quote it, he didn't say you shall not kill, but he said you shall not murder. But they are not to kill someone, put to death someone who is innocent, someone who has not done anything worthy of death. But if someone has violated God's law, done that which is worthy of death, they indeed were to be put to death. And like I said, surprisingly enough, at least it surprised me to find out that there are 16 different things that a person can be convicted of that would warrant their being put to death by the law of God. Now, I'm going to go through this briefly, but if you're interested in more about it, if you have the Apologetics Press Bible that they recently put out, on page 383, they give a list of all 16 of these sins that a person commit that would warrant their being put to death by God's people. And so we just want to go through that very quickly here to look at this. Like I said, 16 reasons why. Number one, those things that be regarded as religious sins. We'll talk about civil sins and so forth that a person could do. Number one, premeditated murder. Exodus 21:14 says, but if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him by treachery, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. So a premeditated murder. And premeditated means what? Planned out beforehand. This is not an accident. You didn't accidentally kill somebody. This isn't something that was deserving. This is a plan that you've devised yourself to kill someone when you had no right to do so. And a person that's guilty of premeditated murder is to be put to death himself. Kidnapping. He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death. I had an elder in one of the churches that I worked with several years ago. He did not like the idea of the death penalty for kidnapping. You have any idea why a person might say kidnapping should not be penalized by death? What he was reasoning was, look, if you kidnap somebody and that demands a death penalty, then you're not going to keep that person kidnapped alive. You're not going to return them, even if you get the full ransom you're asking for. Because that person can be a witness against you and testify you're the one that did it. And so if I'm going to be killed anyway, might as well kill him and get rid of the witness. That was his reason about it. But God does it as a deterrent. And so many of these things that are commanded by God are commanded to try to deter people from committing these crimes to begin with. And God says if you kidnap a person for the purpose of selling him, maybe as a slave, you're to be put to death. But if you kidnap a person and you're caught with him before you've sold him or done anything like that, The fact that you've kidnapped him, God says that individual shall surely be put to death. And so in God's eyes, that is a crime worthy of death. The next two, striking or cursing a parent. Exodus 21, verse 15 and verse 17. And he who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Verse 17, and he who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. If that law were in effect in America today, what do you think that would do to our population? It would lessen our numbers. And you just stop and think about that, though, what it would do to so many groups that say the very idea you're going to put somebody to death because they struck their father or their mother, or just because they cursed them. Well, God said yes. Under His law, had we, and if we were today living under that law in what would be called a theocracy, where God is the ruler, the determiner of all these things, then yes, such a person would still be put to death. Then the next one, incorrigible rebelliousness. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed them, then all the men of his city shall stone him to death with stones. Now, again, that seems rather harsh, doesn't it? To put a child to death that's rebellious. But I think we have to understand here, it's not just because, one day, you say to your son, clean up your room, and he says, not going to do it. That doesn't mean you take him out to have him stoned to death. The Bible emphasizes it's a rebellious type of stubbornness that will not obey. You look at the full meaning of it there in Deuteronomy 21, and also there's another place where it's mentioned, chapter 17, verse 12, but in chapter 21, verses 18 to 21, let you know this is someone who is continuously in rebellion, who continuously refuses to obey. And it's not just his parents, and also in the same passage, I didn't print all of it up here, but that person can also, he refuses to do what the priest tells him. God's spokesman. And he will not listen to what God says through his spokesman, the priest, and will not obey him. And who is who continually is like that and is not willing to change, that person would be put to death. Now the next 6 different things that are mentioned here are religious matters. First are really civil matters. And in these, I didn't print out here all of the passages. I've got the passages there. You can look them up. And like I said again, if you've got that Bible put out by Apologetics Press, page 383, you can find all of those things given. Sacrificing to false gods. A person would be put to death for that. And remember, you're living there, they're living under a theocracy. God is their ruler. And to worship any other god merits death. Violating the Sabbath. Now that was made clear and given the Ten Commandments when God says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And God pointed out to them, you've got 6 days of work, but the seventh day is a day of rest. You're not to work. But there in giving the Ten Commandments, God didn't say, well, what do you do to a person that does violate the Sabbath? But there are other passages that do deal with this. For example, on that, Exodus 35 and verse 2, God requires a person being put to death if he's violating the Sabbath by working on the Sabbath day. There's another occasion, we talked about that, we have that in a little booklet that Jerry wrote that we use in studying with people, where an individual was found gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And they knew what he's doing is wrong. He's violating the Sabbath. He's working on the Sabbath day, but they didn't know what to do with him. So the King James says they put him in war, that is, they put him in jail, while Moses went to God to ask God, what do we do with him? And God said that man was to be stoned to death. He was to be put to death for violating the Sabbath by working on the Sabbath day. Number 7, blasphemy. What is blasphemy? What does it mean to blaspheme? If we don't know, we better be careful. Anything we say, we may be blaspheming. Blasphemy means to speak evil of God or of holy things. Under the law, there were Jews who would be put to death for blaspheming the temple. But if you blaspheme God, you certainly could be put to death. Leviticus chapter 24, verses 10 to 16. A man is found, he was not an Israelite, but he was living among them. He and another man got into an argument and a fight, and this man blasphemed, he cursed the name of God. And God's command to the people was that person would be taken out, and he was to be stoned to death. He's to be put to death for blaspheming God in that way. A false prophecy was worthy of death, according to Deuteronomy 13, verses 1 to 11. Now, this is kind of interesting. You read through that. A false prophecy. What would a false prophecy be? What's a false prophecy? Yeah, it's not teaching the truth. You may prophesy something and it doesn't come to pass. That's a false prophecy. But what's interesting here, the false prophecy they're talking about is a prophecy that does come to pass. There's a man that makes a prophecy, and what he says comes to pass. And then that man goes out and he says to people, come with me. We're going to worship an idol. And if you listen to him, and you say, well, listen, the prophecy he made came to pass. And so I'm going to do what he says. All right, I'll go with you and we'll worship this. God said if you do that, you're worthy of death just as they are. God says, I am testing my people. I am letting a person prophesy something that comes to pass, and then he's going to try to lead you away from God to worship another God, to worship idols. And if you do that, you're guilty of sin. God said, I'm testing you. See, do you really love me? Do you trust me? You're going to do what I say. So a false prophecy, maybe a person prophesies something that comes to pass, but then he uses that as a means of intriguing you, of enticing you to go away and to serve some other God. And God says the one that does that is worthy of death. Human sacrifice. Whoops, didn't need to do that. Human sacrifice. Well, there are a couple of different idols that there were those in Israel, even some of the kings who worshiped them. The one that's mentioned specifically, though, in the passage that I mentioned, Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 2, was the worship of a god named Molech. And we talked about that in other classes. Molech was one of them, that they worshiped that god, that they would take their child, usually an infant, and that idol that was made out of brass, that had a hollow place for its stomach and its arms holding out, and there was a fire inside it. And so that brass idol is heated up, and then they would lay their child on the arms of that idol. And immediately begins to burn and falls down into the stomach of it and dies. There were those who were kings in Israel who sacrificed their children in that way. God says anybody that does that is deserving of death. That demands the penalty of death. Then number 10, divination. Now, divination can be a number of different things. Those who are sorcerers or witches or whatever, who believe that they can communicate with the dead and learn about the future. They can divine what's going to happen in the future by such communications. And you remember when Saul was king, in keeping with what God said, he made it a law that you could not tolerate a witch or sorcerer or such to live. They were to be put to death. And then when Saul, later on, Samuel has died, and he doesn't have someone that can divine for him through God to tell him know about the future. And so he goes to the witch of Endor and tells her he wants her to summon someone from the dead. And the one he wants is Samuel. And Samuel comes up to speak to Saul. But when that happened, the witch of Endor screamed when she saw it, which indicates she probably wasn't expecting that. But nonetheless, there were those who claimed they could speak with the dead and learn what's going to happen in the future. God said you don't suffer a person like that to live. They would be put to death. Now, the next 6 are more or less sexual matters, sexual sins that a person might be involved in. Adultery, Leviticus chapter 20, verses 10 to 21. Someone who is married having sex with someone who is not their spouse are guilty of adultery. And under God's law, they were put to death for that. Both parties would be put to death. And there was one occasion where a Levite, or not a Levite, but a Jewish person was having sex with one, not his wife. And I believe it was a Levite who took his spear and went in and thrust them both through. And he was praised by God for what he had done, because these people were violating God's law, committing adultery. Then next, let's see if I put all of these up here. Bestiality. And that's bestiality, not bestiality, bestiality. Having sex with an animal. If you're like me for the longest, I thought it was bestiality. I thought, well, a beast, that would make sense. But it's really bestiality. And there were people then, as there are people in our world today, that have sex with animals. And God says that such people as that are to be put to death. It's not to be tolerated among God's people. Then there's incest, having sex with a near relative. Now, there was a time when God did allow marriage between people who were close relatives because of the limited population. But later on, when God gave His law, He limited it. You could not have sexual relations with a near relative. They were not allowed to marry them. Then homosexuality. And there are a lot of passages in the Bible that talk about it. But the 2 that I mentioned, Leviticus 18:22, and that just says that a man shall not lie with a man as he lies with a woman. In other words, you don't have sex with a man like you would have sex with a woman. So homosexuality is wrong. And then in chapter 20 and verse 13, God gives a penalty for it. They're to be put to death. And again, if you were to preach such as that today, you really would be in trouble, big time. But that was God's law under the old law, when God was the leader. There was a theocracy that people lived under. Premarital sex or prostitution, Leviticus chapter 21 and verse 9, and then 16, rape, Deuteronomy 22, 25 to 27. If a woman was forced into having sex with a man, and if she cried out for help and no help came, she was not considered guilty. She would not be put to death. But if she failed to cry out for help, God said in effect it's as if she is consenting to the act. And so because of that, she would be put to death along with the man that was raping her. But that was a crime that God says deserved death. Now there's one other thing that's mentioned in the Bible, not among these 16, that a person could kill someone when it would not necessarily be a crime in the eyes of God. What would that be? War. And there were times when God commanded His people to go to war. And that was because God was punishing the people that they're sending Israel against in battle. But anytime a nation is attacked by someone without reason, without provocation, then they have a right to defend themselves, whether it's a nation in war or whether it's an individual defending himself against someone trying to take his life. Look at that one example I want to look at here, 1 Samuel 15, verses 2 and 3. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Because of what Amalek had done, when God has brought His people up out of Egypt, bringing them up to the land that He's promised them, that He promised to Abraham years before, Amalek attacked them and killed some of God's people and would not allow them to pass through that land. And so God now tells His people, Now that you've grown, you have that strength and power, God said, I want you to utterly destroy the nation of Amalek because of what they've done. This is God bringing punishment upon them for what they had done to God's people, defending God's people for what was happening to them. Now, like I said, what happens there in regard to nations, when a nation is attacked, as Israel had been by Amalek, they have a right to defend themselves. And God had said He would see to it that Amalek is punished, and now He's doing it through sending Israel against them. But the same thing's true for an individual. If an individual is attacked, if his life is in danger, he has a right to defend himself. Now, there's one example that I could think about, 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 18 to 23, that I did not put that on the screen. If you want to write that down, 2 Samuel 2, 18 to 23. This was a time in a war, a time between those who were, following David and others who had followed Joab. And there was a battle. They'd gotten together, 25 men from each one, and they, in their battle, grabbed each other by the beard and with their right hand thrust them through with the sword. So all 25 of them were killed on each side. And when that happened, then the Israelites began to flee from Judah, and the battle was going on there. And in the story, what's happening was Abner was fleeing, and one of Joab's younger brothers, Azael, was following after him, intending on killing him. And so when that happened, Abner told him, says, turn aside, take battle with one of the other young men, and take what spoil you can from them, but don't follow me. I don't want to kill you. But he continued to follow. And a second time, Abner told him, don't make me kill you, because if you do that, how am I going to face your brother Joab? I don't want to be the one guilty of killing you. But Azael wouldn't have anything to do with it. He continued on. And so Abner, defended himself, killed Azael. He was justified in it. But later on, when Abner is working to bring Israel back to David, David accepts that and he sends Abner on his way. And when Joab finds out what's happened, Joab is angry and he sends a messenger after Abner to tell him to come back. And Abner comes back, and Joab takes him aside to speak with him. But when he got him aside, Joab killed Abner. There's a difference in his killing Abner and Abner in killing his brother Azael. Abner was justified because it was in a time of war, and he was defending himself against an enemy. But what Joab did was in a time of peace. And later on, David, though he was the king, David said, I'm not in a position to bring Joab to justice. Joab was the leader of the army, and David was afraid that he couldn't do anything to him. So as David is old and near death, he tells his son Solomon, who's going to become king in his place, 1 Kings 2, 5 and 6. David says, moreover, you know also what Joab, the son of Zeruiah, did to me, and what he did to the two commanders of the armies of Israel, to Abner the son of Ner, and Amasa the son of Jether, whom he killed. And he shed the blood of war in peacetime, and put the blood of war on his belt that was around his waist, and on his sandals that were on his feet. Therefore do according to your wisdom, and do not let his gray hair go down to the grave in peace. David is saying here that what Joab did was wrong. He was killing a person in a time of peace, so this was murder. But his brother Azael had been killed in war, when the one who killed him, Abner, was defending himself. And though David was not able to do anything about it, now that Solomon, he becomes king and is in power, he tells him, don't let Joab go down to the grave in peace. In other words, use your wisdom and see to it that this man is punished for what he's done. So there are times in war when a person may be justified in killing another. But in time of peace, there is no right to kill someone. For whatever reason you have, you cannot do that. So, that was then. Under the old law, that was a time when there was a theocracy and God ruled. But today we don't live in a theocracy. We don't live under the old law. But that authority still abides with God. But God has also given authority now to governments to carry out the punishing of those who are violating the laws of the land. So in the New Testament, God's authorized legal governments to execute those who are guilty of capital offenses. One passage we'll look at here tonight on that, Romans 13, verses 1 through 4. Paul says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same." Then verse 4, "For he," that is the government, "is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil." To resist that authority, Paul says, is to resist God. If you resist the government's authority that God has placed in their power, in reality, you're resisting God. To resist that authority is to bring judgment upon the one that's resisting. So if you resist the authority of that government, whatever that government is, remember when Paul wrote this, Israel was being ruled by Rome. And at that time, being ruled by Nero, one of the worst rulers, and there were many of them in Rome, who were evil in what they did to people. But if you resist that authority, you're bringing judgment upon yourself. That authority has the power of the sword. That means they have the power to execute. The sword was a means of executing people in that time. Now, under Roman law, the sword was a way of executing a Roman citizen who was guilty. Everybody else might be put to death by crucifixion. But Rome would not allow one of their own citizens to be killed that way. And so they were put to death by the sword. And so Paul speaks here as a Roman citizen. He speaks that Roman authority, those Roman rulers, they have the power of the sword. They have the power to execute people who are violating the law. And we need to respect it. And the thing about it is that God wanted them to respect it, wants us to respect it, and Paul and Jesus both certainly did that. If we have a time when we get through these two to show that to be the case, first of all, consider the example of Paul in this regard. Acts 25, beginning at 9b and going through verse 11. Paul was asked the question, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things?" So Paul said, "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. For if I am an offender or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar." Paul doesn't want to go and stand trial before those Jews. He knows they're prejudiced against him. He knows they want him put to death. And Paul says, "Listen, I am standing where I need to be standing for judgment. I am standing here at Caesar's judgment seat. You are a governor, a ruler of the people here. You represent Caesar in that regard. You have that authority to try me." And Paul says, if I've done anything worthy of death, I don't seek to escape death. I'm willing to accept that. But Paul knows he hasn't done anything worthy of death. And he's not going to be tried fairly by the Jews, and so he's going to be tried where he needs to be by Caesar. And as a Roman citizen, he exercised the right to appeal to Caesar. And so for that reason, Paul was sent to Caesar. But notice, Paul recognized that Rome had the authority to put him to death if he's done anything wrong. And the same thing is true in regard to Jesus. We're not going to have time to get to that. But just give consideration to this. We'll talk about it next week. Jesus himself, I believe, upheld the authority of Rome to execute him, to put him to death, to try him. Now, he knows that Rome was wrong in killing him because Jesus is innocent. No government has the right to kill an innocent person. But there's another person who's guilty of putting Jesus to death. And that person has a greater sin than Pilate has. Think about who that might be. And we'll talk about that, Lord willing, next week. All right, before we dismiss, our time's gone. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you again for letting us be here together tonight to study from thy word, and help us, Father, to take from it the things that we need to do to be able to please thee, and to recognize, Father, thy authority is extended in the authority you've given to government. And help us, Father, to be obedient to government in every way that we can, realizing also that no government has the right to command any of us to violate your will. And so if we're ever commanded to do that, no, we have to remain faithful to thee. But if what they command us to do is within keeping of your will, we need to obey, lest we bring judgment upon ourselves. Please dismiss us in your care and safety, and keep us always in thy care, Father, and allow us to be back again this coming Wednesday. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.